Robert Dean has a list of credentials a mile long. He served 4 years from 1963 to 1967 at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers, Europe, the military arm of NATO. He was an intelligence analyst with a cosmic top-secret clearance.
Well, Don, it began for me in 1963 when I was assigned to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe. I arrived in the summer of '63 and I was assigned to the Operations Division. I was further assigned to what we call SHOC, the War Room, the Supreme Headquarters Operations Center. And at that time I was given a cosmic top-secret clearance, which was and still is the highest level of security access that NATO has. When I was assigned to the War Room, I learned that a study had been initiated in 1961, and everybody was talking about it. They were gossiping about it. The subject was UFOs, and that intrigued me a bit. When that study was concluded in 1964 and it was published, and I was still working in the War Room at that time, I had access to this document. I had a chance to read it. And having been exposed to it, I must tell you honestly that my life has never ever quite been the same. Because I read first-hand reports, verifiable NATO military material that indicated that the UFOs were not only real, that they represented something far beyond anything I had ever imagined before. When the study was concluded in '64, they concluded that there were 4 different groups apparently coming and visiting us. Out of those 4 different groups, one group looked exactly like we do, so much so that they could sit beside you in a restaurant or in an airplane or in a theater, and you'd never know. And that particular point bothered the military guys a lot. The point being that some of these people from somewhere could be walking up and down the corridors of SHAPE headquarters, or they could be walking up and down the corridors of the Pentagon. One day at lunch, a lieutenant colonel made the remark, he says, "Jesus, do you realize they could even be in the White House?" And there was a little forced laughter at that point, I remember, because a lot of us over the years have had some misgivings about the occupants of the White House. But the point I'm making is that the idea that aliens could be here in our midst bothered the military, because if you're not paranoid when you go into the service, you're certainly trained very quickly to be so. It's the nature of the military mind, I think, to be paranoid. But that was only part of the story. The SHAPE conclusions in '64 were that there were 4 groups that we knew of. They were apparently interplanetary. Some very likely were interstellar. They even concluded that some of them could be intergalactic. When I retired in 1976, many of our military people knew at that point that we were not simply dealing with visitations from people from other planets or star systems. They had concluded by '76 that some of these visitors very well might be multidimensional in their source. The evidence that we had collected and the evidence that they had repeatedly demonstrated to us, and that's no accident. It became very clear after a time that there was a program or a process of some kind underway, that they had demonstrated over and over and over again that they apparently were able to manipulate matter and time. Now, this really shook up our scientists. There are a lot of new young scientists in particle physics today who talk about multiple dimensions. There's a brilliant young professor in New York by the name of Michio Kaku, who's written a brilliant book called Hyperspace, where they talk about 10 separate dimensions. I'm not enough of a physicist to try to explain to you what a dimension is, but the idea that there could be intelligences from somewhere else, from other dimensions, coming and going into our reality. It's been quite a shakeup in traditional science. I guess I speak out openly and bluntly about this because I feel so strongly about it. I violate my security oath every time I speak about it. I do it intentionally, and I do it on purpose, because I feel so strongly that the American people not only have a right to know the truth, but they have a need to know the truth. The truth, Don, apparently is simply this, that we're not alone, we've never been alone. We are apparently part of an infinite universe filled with intelligent life. I find that exciting. It doesn't frighten me. The SHAPE study concluded in '64 that if they, whoever they were malevolent or hostile, that they could have taken this planet and cleaned it up and eliminated us, turned us into dog food or whatever, a long, long time ago. That the historical evidence indicates that they've been with us a long time, And I've concluded that we had what I like to call an intimate interrelationship with at least one of those groups, the group that looks exactly like we do. And that point is I don't like the word alien. I don't think the term alien is appropriate at all here. I like to refer to them as family. We're related to them. I think they had a hand in our being here. And I think the time has come where we're about to meet our extended family. It's going to be very soon. And the people are not ready. And one of the reasons I do speak out so bluntly and so openly is if in some small way I can help people get prepared for this. Because I believe that this reality, once we have accepted it and understood it and gone beyond the fear, will bring about an expansion of consciousness in the human race that will truly help us and prepare us to go out there and take our rightful place in that infinite community of life.
Viewers have concluded that yes, it's going to happen this time. That we and it will be on the same side of the sun at the same time. And if the remote viewer, and they're getting their information from ETs, from sources within the U.S. government that tell me that yes, they are deeply concerned about it, and they're worried sick about it, and they don't know what to do about it. What could the government or anyone else tell you? What could they say to you? Would they tell you that grab your hat, dig a hole, hang on? He says, oh, it seems to be a rather nice planet, and we know about it, and all we need to do is name it. And then bless his heart, you know, he had never had a heart problem, but within a year he was dead with a heart attack. Incredible race of humans does have a future, and it is in the stars. Mm-hmm. And we are going out there to reclaim our rightful place. But I think why I'm getting away with what I'm getting away with, so to speak, where I'm releasing bits and pieces of this cover-up, is that there's somebody back there somewhere who wants me to do what I'm doing, or I would not have been able to do this. But let me give you a tiny tidbit of bits and pieces that come from the Old Voice Network. There is an organization called the National Reconnaissance Office. You've probably heard of them.
Absolutely.
A very super secret group, and super secret group among super secret groups. God, we've got so damn many groups now. As I used to jokingly say, when poor old Ike left office, he tried to tell us about the military-industrial complex. Well, it's a triad now. It's not just the military and industry. Mm-hmm. It's the national security agencies as well. Mm-hmm. So that if he could see it today, he'd be shocked even more. Of course, I'm sure he's alive and well somewhere, so he's probably looking down, chuckling. But we are a triad now. The super secret agencies with the military and the industry. It's all like this. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, there are people who I think want this out. We've known for years that among the in crowd, whoever the hell they are, and no one really has ever been able to put their finger on it. We've been able to grab a couple of them from the old Magi group, the wise men they called themselves. The Magi, you've heard them referred to as Majestic 12. Well, they're a lot more than 12 now. Anyhow, I'm getting away with sharing bits and pieces and tidbits which intrigue me because I think somebody wants some of this out. But the story I was going to share with you is that in the National Reconnaissance Office, about, I guess, 4 or 5 years now, they had for a number of years a series of satellites called the Keyhole system. You've heard of it?
Yes.
Keyhole. Oh, it was super secret and probably the very best satellite system in the world. Mm-hmm. Well, they probably made it even better now. They could supposedly read a postage stamp from space. Well, there were some intriguing questions being raised by a number of people about what was known as the Ararat anomaly. Are you familiar with the Ararat anomaly?
Mount Ararat, Noah's Ark.
Okay.
And so the guys in the NRO took their keyhole system and focused on the Ararat anomaly, which is, you know, a puzzle. Well, when the word got out, when the pictures finally were downloaded, and they computerized and enhanced them and cleaned them up, and they pushed them on the wall, or they broadcast them on the wall there at NRO, the remarks went something like this, and these are actual quotes. Jesus Christ, it's a goddamn boat. Christ, it's a big boat. Okay, one would say, why would something like that be so highly classified that it is way above top secret? Why would the discovery of a boat on Mount Ararat be classified so high, far above, anything? Anyhow, the story comes out. The reason they classified it is because after they discovered that it was a goddamn boat, a big goddamn boat, they inserted a team of SEALs on the site. Now, that's a term that the military uses to put a bunch of guys on a scene.
Right.
Apparently they dropped them by aircraft, they parachuted down, a dozen of them or so. They inserted them onto the scene, and these guys spent several days in this goddamn boat. And then they extracted them by helicopters. And when they extracted them, the guys brought with them some anomalous artifacts, which have never been described or named. But those anomalous artifacts is what led to this whole thing being classified not only top secret, but way the hell above. And that's a little bit of information that's come out via the network of the old
So are
boys.
you saying this is Noah's Ark?
No one knows what it is. It was originally the Ararat anomaly. But then they discovered that it was a gigantic boat, apparently.
But a boat built by humans.
Well, it appears to be. Mm-hmm. It's essentially, from what they gathered, wood. Mm-hmm. But it's a work of genius, apparently. It was intricately put together. And it's really...
And it survived all these years.
Well, apparently. The question, how many years, When was the flood? The last rumor I had was 12,000 years ago. 10,500 BC.
When are they saying? I mean, I'm sure you have a theory.
Well, the religious implications of it, you see. Every ancient culture on the planet has a similar tradition about a flood. And I'm sure there were many Noahs, so to speak, wherever. But the idea that this particular thing is so theologically sensitive that some yo-yo back there at NRO decided to classify it. And then they sent the SEALs in, and the SEALs brought back artifacts. Well, there you are, you see. What could they have possibly found in this big wreck that is so sensitive? The question arises, I don't know the answer to that. Hopefully, if the old boy still stays alive a few years, we might find out. I find that interesting, and I share it with people because it gives you an insight into that bunch of nitwits back there that classify everything. Under the ice in Antarctica, there is a freshwater lake, deep, deep down under the ice. That's 100 miles long, about 50 miles wide. Fresh water. The temperature in the damn lake is about 65 degrees, which is pleasant swimming, you might say. But at the end of Lake Vostok is what's known as a gigantic mass con, a mass concentration of metal, very similar to the mass cons they discovered on the moon. Gigantic circular-shaped metallic objects deep under the ice at the end of Lake Vostok. Highly classified. JPL had it. National Security Agency took it away from JPL. It's one of the most sensitive things in the world now as to what is the anomaly at the end of the lake, the mass concentration that is so easily picked up by satellites. Another top secret, Mm-hmm. The common folk, you're not supposed to know that.
Right.
Why? Well, you can't handle this, you see. The implications. I think it's a public relations front.
Right. Yeah.
Blue Book never handled the real good stuff. And everybody knew that, mm-hmm. except the common folk out there, who were diddled regularly and never told the truth about anything. But the big secret seems to have been for so long is why are we keeping classified the enormous facilities on the moon? And they're not ours.
Whose are they?
Well, that's a good question. I can tell you flatly who they are.
Okay.
You familiar with the term Anunnaki?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, you really have to understand Zecharia Sitchin's work mm-hmm. to really grasp where we stand today in relationship with this group of intelligences, and I'm not speaking of one, there are several. The last I heard, there were 4 different groups we were relating with. The Anunnaki are one, and there are others.
Okay, I mean, this is very interesting. Can you describe the Anunnaki that first of all, have you had exposure to them face to face?
Me?
Yeah.
Yes, I've met some face to face.
Okay.
Now, whether they were the Anunnaki, I don't know.
Okay, well.
The ones I've run face to face were typically human.
Typically human.
I mean, they could put on a suit, tie, a dress, blue jeans, T-shirt,
Okay.
walk in our midst, and you would never know.
And they weren't 9 feet tall or higher?
No, the ones I've met and the ones I've seen aboard the ships are not that big at all. They're just like us.
Uh-huh.
So we're dealing with 4 different groups that I've concluded, my own personal view.
Okay.
Yeah, you might talk to Jim Sparks and he might tell you there are 8 or 10 or a dozen more. You know, I don't know. I can only tell you what little bit I've learned over the years. There are 4 different groups that I've encountered, and they're all humanoid. One group is completely human, and not all of the Anunnaki are 9 feet tall. They were human enough that we are related to them, and they're related to us. And that lovely little story in chapter 6 of Genesis is quite true. They did indeed engineer the genes and chromosomes of an existing species on this planet. God knows how long ago. Sitchin says it was 200,000 years.
But what about Planet X?
Oh, it's a reality.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So what are they going to do about that?
Well, apparently they are concerned about, you know the story, according to Sitchin and according to the Sumerians, it's a reality. Mm-hmm. Well, our astronomers apparently have concluded that it is indeed a reality. For almost a century, astronomers have been concerned and interested about what they called an intruder that seems to come and go from time to time, and they can measure it by the perturbations and the effects on other planets. They've known its existence for a long time, but they've never gone public about it. Well, in the early 80s, the JPL, the guys at
Jet Propulsion
Propulsion, used to call it Jack Parsons Laboratory.
Yes.
Which I think is probably where the original JPL came from.
Yes.
Because Jack Parsons established it. Anyhow, they set out a couple of Pioneers satellites back in '82 just to try to determine if there was some truth to it. Mm-hmm. And the Pioneers apparently came back with data which said not only yes, but hell yes. And the Pioneers concluded, the Pioneer satellite data concluded. So, wow, astronomers were troubled by that. Whew. Could this thing be real? And well, what did they do? They sent out what they called an infrared astronomical satellite. I think they called it IRAS, anyhow, and this was done in '83. They sent the IRAS out, taking infrared pictures all around the ecliptic, above and below. And apparently IRAS got 2 giant positive responses that yes, the 12th planet, the 10th planet, however you want to call it, yes, it's real. And that's when the lid slammed down.
So it's out there, it's on its way back in, right?
According to the Sumerians and Sitchin, apparently it is. And if you're a student of history, as one of my majors, its last pass was 1600 BC. The Sumerians and Sitchin and all of those say it has an orbit of 3,600 years. Mm-hmm. So as like many of us, I count on my fingers and toes and figure out, well, 1600 BC, it has an orbit of 3,600 years. Wow, it's due. Well, apparently it is.
So
now,
why are they keeping this a secret?
Because
you're an expert on secrets.
Listen, every time Nibiru would make a pass, it was not always devastating. It would depend on whether the planet Earth and Nibiru were on the same side of the sun at the same time. Mm-hmm. And if we were on the same side of the sun at the same time, all hell would break loose on planet Earth. Well, apparently the last pass triggered the explosion of Santorini, Terra, the volcano in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, blew its top, brought to a close the great Minoan civilization. Among other things, it affected Egypt. It's all in the records, apparently. There are even historians and theologians who say that Santorini's explosion is exactly what you're reading about when the plagues and all hit Egypt that allowed Moses to get the Israelites out. But if you look at 1600 BC and figuring that was a relatively recent past, it's due now, and apparently the guys in the astronomical observatories know it. And that, again, is above top secret. Let me give you a tiny example. For a number of years ago, there were two brilliant guys working at the Naval Observatory in Washington. Tom Van Flandern is one, who I hope you've interviewed.
No, but yeah, please continue, and we'd love to do
He's
that.
no longer with the Naval Observatory. The other one was the chief astronomer at the observatory, a brilliant man by the name of Robert Harrington.
Right.
And Harrington gave an interview to Zecharia Sitchin a number of years ago, I think it was 91 or so, where he came right out and said, Dr. Sitchin, we are interested in this because it ties in perfectly with the work you've done on the Sumerians and the ancient planet Nibiru. He said, we found it, it's real, we have photographs of it, and he says from what we can put together, it's a rather nice planet. It's about 2.5 times the size of the Earth. Apparently it's heading toward the system, the center of the system. We've concluded about everything about it except that we haven't named it. And Zechariah spoke up and he says, it's already been named. He says, you simply call it Nibiru. The Sumerians it's not an icy rock. And yes, when it makes its long journey out and back, it gets so far away from the sun that the sun is probably no more than a little tiny prick of light, a little tiny pinpoint. And if you would think that it would be naturally icy cold. No, apparently the planet, like many planets in the system here, generate its own heat. It has in its core a generating heat system very much like our own. We have a system within the core of this planet that has been described as a thermonuclear reaction, very similar to the sun. Now, most of the life and all of the bounty and all of the beauty of life on this planet comes from our going around this beautiful sun. But I don't think Nibiru is an icy rock. No, I think, first of all, that it probably generates enough of its own heat, and I think they probably did indeed create for themselves, with the advanced technology that they have, a kind of a Dyson sphere. Are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. You know what brilliant British astronomer, I think, Freeman Dyson, said some years ago, that an incredibly advanced technology will have the ability to enclose its planet and retain not only its heat, but its atmosphere. And I suspect that the Anunnaki have done that to Nibiru, and they probably did it, good enough, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million years ago. So the planet, I think the color from it, the dull red golden color is a result of that envelope of gold shell that they've created. They've created for themselves a Dyson sphere around their planet. And I suspect that any advanced technology will ultimately do the same, simply because it makes sense. It's a practical thing.
Robert Dean has a list of credentials a mile long. He served 4 years from 1963 to 1967 at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers, Europe, the military arm of NATO. He was an intelligence analyst with a cosmic top-secret clearance.
Well, Don, it began for me in 1963 when I was assigned to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe. I arrived in the summer of '63 and I was assigned to the Operations Division. I was further assigned to what we call SHOC, the War Room, the Supreme Headquarters Operations Center. And at that time I was given a cosmic top secret clearance, which was and still is the highest level of security access that NATO has. When I was assigned to the War Room, I learned that a study had been initiated in 1961, and everybody was talking about it. They were gossiping about it. The subject was UFOs, and that intrigued me a bit. When that study was concluded in 1964 and it was published, and I was still working in the War Room at that time, I had access to this document. I had a chance to read it. And having been exposed to it, I must tell you honestly that my life has never ever quite been the same. Because I read first-hand reports, verifiable NATO military material that indicated that the UFOs were not only real, but they represented something far beyond anything I had ever imagined before. When the study was concluded in '64, they concluded that there were 4 different groups apparently coming and visiting us. Out of those 4 different groups, one group looked exactly like we do, so much so that they could sit beside you in a restaurant or in an airplane or in a theater, and you'd never know. And that particular point bothered the military guys a lot. The point being that some of these people from somewhere could be walking up and down the corridors of SHAPE headquarters, or they could be walking up and down the corridors of the Pentagon. One day at lunch, a lieutenant colonel made the remark, he says, "Jesus, do you realize they could even be in the White House?" And there was a little forced laughter at that point, I remember, because a lot of us over the years have had some misgivings about the occupants of the White House. But the point I'm making is that the idea that aliens could be here in our midst bothered the military, because if you're not paranoid when you go into the service, you're certainly trained very quickly to be so. It's the nature of the military mind, I think, to be paranoid. But that was only part of the story. The SHAPE conclusions in '64 were that there were 4 groups that we knew of. They were apparently interplanetary. Some very likely were interstellar. They even concluded that some of them could be intergalactic. When I retired in 1976, many of our military people knew at that point that we were not simply dealing with visitations from people from other planets or star systems. They had concluded by '76 that some of these visitors very well might be multidimensional in their source. The evidence that we had collected and the evidence that they had repeatedly demonstrated to us, and that's no accident. It became very clear after a time that there was a program or a process of some kind underway, that they had demonstrated over and over and over again that they apparently were able to manipulate